welcome to Down the Garden Path podcast. Thank you for joining me here today. And today we're talking about roses. I have with me Paul Zimmerman, and he is the owner of Paul Zimmerman Roses, a company dedicated to budding the rose grower in all of us. Paul is also an independent consultant to Jackson Perkins. He's an author of the book Everyday Roses, published by Taunton Press, as well as a garden designer and consultant to botanical and private gardens. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you, Joanne. It's nice to be here. I appreciate you having me on. It's lovely. I've been to Canada several times and I always love the country, and it's nice to talk to Canada.
Excellent. So we have many things to talk about, but one of the key things is the exciting news for Canadian rose gardeners that Jackson Perkins is now shipping their roses into Canada.
Yes, we are. We're very, very happy about that, and it's been a long time in the making, slowly but surely. We have a terrific CEO in Kelly Funk who's challenged us to take the company in new directions and explore, think outside the box, essentially, is what she's asked us to do. And that's what basically began this process of bringing, Jackson Perkins, 150 years of genetics into Canada.
Excellent. And I probably am saying it wrong because you're not really shipping them into Canada. We are growing them here.
That is correct. And that is what made all of this possible at the end of the day. So if I can give a little bit of background, is that okay?
Absolutely.
Start there?
That's perfect. Yeah. I think some background on Jackson Perkins and Bakker. That'd be great.
Right. So Jackson Perkins has been around our breeding program is well over 100 years old. Esteemed rose breeders that go way back to the beginning. Certainly Gene Borner, nicknamed Papa Floribunda, created the Floribunda class. William Warner, Keith Zeri. You go back and look at genetics from Jackson Perkins that a lot of the roses that you know and love have been created and bred by Jackson Perkins. We are now looking at other roses from overseas, and we can talk about that in a little bit. But we've always had a presence in America, and we had a presence in Europe for a while, but we never really had much of a presence in Canada. Some, but not a lot. And about 4 or 5 years ago, we partnered with J.C. Bakker and Sons, which is a Canadian grower of plants and roses in particular. They are, I think it's second or third generation, so forgive me if I got that wrong. But they are based in Canada, like I mentioned, family business. So we started having them grow some roses for us. They ticked a lot of boxes for us. Okay. First of all, they were not a huge grower, so they were responsive to the way that we work and what we wanted to do. We wanted someone along those lines. The other thing that we take very seriously at Jackson Perkins is what's called virus indexing. And it's rose mosaic virus. We don't need to get into the details, but essentially it's a disease that's transmitted through the propagation process. Excuse me. Unless you know how to keep the roses clean. And Bakker is extremely dedicated to that process. So that was a big, big reason why we wanted to work with them. And then from there, the logical discussion became, okay, well, how can we begin to get our roses into Canada? And sell them, and without shipping them from, America, which is we didn't want to have to deal with. And so with Bakker growing our roses in Canada, helping us with selections, and we can get into all that as well. That's what began this process. So the answer to your question in short is yes. These are Canadian grown, Canadian tested by Canadian nursery and shipped within Canada. So we're really, really proud of that partnership.
Excellent. And how, I think we spoke a little bit before the show about the choice of, because there's so many rose varieties. So how did we decide on which ones were best for our Canadian? And the Canadian climate is, from coast to coast, a little bit different.
Yes, it is. It's very diverse. That's like America. I mean, we don't get as cold as you get. Maybe get into Minnesota, you probably could. But yeah, that had to be taken into account, the Canadian climate and the range of the Canadian climate. Yes. I've visited Vancouver and Victoria. That's a much different climate than certainly the central portion of Canada. But that's where Bakker's knowledge of Canada and the Canadian climate and the Canadian rose industry came into play. So they got all of our roses a number of years ago, and essentially they've been testing them in their climate on their growing grounds. So they were able to evaluate, say, okay, these can handle Canadian growing conditions, these cannot. So that was the first call. Bakker basically came to us and said, these are the roses that we feel we should be offered to Canadian growers based on our experience of growing and raising roses in Canada. So that was the very, very first cut. Was Bakker made that cut for us. And that was part of the great part of this partnership.
That's interesting. I think that's going to be a cool job from on their side to do that.
It's not bad. You know, I've done it myself. You wander through fields and go, I like that one. I like that one. I don't like that one. I don't like that one. Like, you know, someone has to get paid to go look at roses.
Yeah. And we're talking all types of roses, right? Because roses, that's a big category. There's climbing roses, floribundas, like you mentioned, shrub roses.
Yeah, we are. We're talking the entire, basically, and pardon me, I'm looking at notes here, so just forgive me as I move along here. Yeah, basically, we're looking at everything from hybrid tea to floribunda to shrub, you know, landscape type used roses, large roses, fragrance. We try to do a good broad diversity of the roses. And these are roses, by the way, that are unique to Jackson Perkins pretty much. So they're not something that you're going to be able to get somewhere else. We wanted to, you know, we have all of these unique genetics at Jackson Perkins. We wanted to make sure that we featured those. And there's a Canadian website too. You know, it's jacksonperkins.ca, if my memory serves.
Yes, I checked that out.
Yeah, that's a very specific website. Though that's got the roses that are in Canada that you can order from Canada that are shipped from Bakker in Canada. So that's the thing. But yeah, it's a broad diversity, but that's what Jackson Perkins has always offered is this broad diversity. And in many ways, you know, a leading edge of genetics. That's what Jackson Perkins has done for 100 years of breeding.
I don't want to get too sciencey, but can we talk a little bit about the genetics and how that works and how do we get it from, yes, and how it works? How's that?
Yeah. So basically, so rose breeding, if we go, okay, we'll get a little geeky here.
Okay.
Okay, I love this. So essentially, the original roses on the planet are the species roses. And there's roughly about 120 species roses known around the world, most of them in the Northern Hemisphere. I don't think there's any in the Southern Hemisphere. So that's where roses began. Then what began to happen was slowly but surely, the birds and the bees began to cross roses. So pollen from rosin A goes on to rose B, and they set the hips, those berries that you see in the wintertime there, that gets you a new cross. And then around the 1800s, there's a Scotsman who then began, and Harry Bennett, who then began slowly making organized crosses. Say, I'm going to keep track of what I'm doing. Then when the kind of trade opened up with the clipper ships and things like that, all of a sudden repeat flowering roses came into play because there were no repeat flowering roses in the Western world until the China trade opened up. And there's 4 stud Chinas is what they're called that all repeat flowering roses go back to. So that's how the genetics come. So then as a rose breeder, you're saying, okay, what do I want to breed for? I want to breed, you know, beauty. Obviously, we all want to breed for that. Resistance, fragrance. Do I want a climber? Do I want something tall, short? What am I looking to do? It's a bit of a gamble because you don't know the genetics. I always say it's like the redheaded child in a family of brunettes. All of a sudden, there it is. Well, that could be 6 generations ago is where that comes from. But that's in essence what the breeding programs are like. And these breeding programs take years to develop. I mean, you know, you talk to a rose breeder, the first 10 years is just sort of getting your feet under you. And then it goes from there. And then, you know, so they breed the roses, they test the seedlings. You know, a good breeding program might test 100,000, 150,000 seedlings. And 10 years later, through trial and error and process and all the different things, maybe 4 to 5 make it to market. So it is an incredibly long and drawn out process to get to that rose that the customer then ends up buying and putting in their garden.
And so for our customers listening that buy roses and you're wondering why it's the price it is, and you can see there's a reason for that, right? There's a lot that goes into that rose that's sitting in a pot at your garden center.
Yeah, there is. It's not just picking a plant out of a field somewhere. I mean, if you stop and think about raising, you know, 150,000 seedlings over 10 years to end up with 5, just the cost of and all the crossing is done by hand. There's no machines. You know, it's a human being in greenhouses generally with, you know, maybe 200-300 different rose plants. And they take a small artist brush and they brush pollen from this rose. And then they take that and they brush the pollen onto the anthers of the other rose. And then all these hips, these berries are harvested by hand. They're processed by hand. They're stratified. They're planted by hand. They're evaluated by hand. I mean, it's a fascinating process. If you ever get a chance to go visit a rose breeder, I would advise people do. I know Canada for quite a while up at the Manitoba Research Station had a very good rose
Oh,
breeding program.
okay.
William Baffin, John Cabot, the Canadian Explorer series,
Mm-hmm.
very early days of Canadian, obviously bred for winter hardiness, among everything else. But it's, if you ever get a chance to go see a rose breeding program, I still, 20 years later, just find it absolutely fascinating to look at.
Oh, that is incredible. And we found something that AI can't do.
Yes, we did. I love it. I hadn't thought about that. You're right. Yeah. You can't go to that chat PT and say, I want a yellow fragrant climber. It's going to go, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. We need that
Yeah. I
paintbrush.
can
That
replace
is
that job with, yeah.
fascinating. Yeah, so I'm
Yeah.
really hoping that to just have homeowners and my listeners that are, regular gardeners just understand what goes into that. And so I think so you summed it up very nicely, for
Thank you.
sure.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
that's the research and the homework that Jackson Perkins does before the rose even shows up. And then, with Bakker then testing it for the Canadian climate. Bakker also uses, again, we'll geek out a little bit here, but there's different root stocks that roses tend to be bred onto. Some go own root, which is where the rose is basically struck as a cutting. So the root system is the same as the rose above the ground, if that makes sense.
Okay. Hmm.
That's an own root rose. Then grafting or budding, the two words are interchangeable. The rose is then grafted onto an understock. And the understock tends to be a vigorous variety of rose that will help push the growth above the ground, which in a climate like Canada, when you get a bare root rose, you want it established very, very quickly because your summer might not be very long, depending on where you live in Canada. So by winter, you want that thing established to be able to handle the climate that we all know is coming in Canada. So Bakker uses a rootstock called Rosa multiflora. The R indicates it's one of the original species. The other reason that we like that is they can grow it in a way that we can ensure we're not getting the rose mosaic virus in. So it's part of the virus indexing program that we have.
Perfect.
But the Rosa multiflora is an outstanding rootstock for Canada. And that was one of the other keys to this whole thing is that if the rose has to be grown in a way and on an understock that makes it an outstanding rose for Canada. Multiflora is a wonderful rose for Canada. And that's time tested over decades and decades and decades. So they're not only Canadian grown, but they're grown under a rootstock that is extremely good and easy to grow in Canada. So these are all the little things that we have to think about before we even begin to put the website up,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's excellent. And I do want to come back to rootstock, but I do want to ask about the choosing of the Canadian, so Bakker picked the ones that they felt were the best growers.
Yes. Yeah, they picked the
And
ones that they felt were the best growers for Canada. They had about, 150 or varieties, 100 to 150, and they had them in their fields outside, no winter protection. And they would want to go through and say, this is good, this is good. So that's what they picked. And, some of them are roses that we have bred ourselves. I mean, we've got, Simply Magnificent, which is a beautiful bred, the flora rose, kind of plum colored. And as the name implies, it's fragrant, the Simply Magnificent is what it is. So that's a really lovely rose. La Park is a beautiful rose. We have some roses from a New Zealand breeder named John Ford that we're just beginning to work with. Flash Gordon and Big Ben, excuse me. And so that's how we began to select these roses. So we wanted a broad range with the criteria that they did well in Canada.
and they did well in Canada.
Yeah, and that's where Bakker's, decades of experience working with roses from a broad range of different people that they worked with really came into play. They have an historical knowledge of rose growing in Canada that was extremely vital to this program.
That is great. So back to the rootstock, I think
Huh?
one of the things roses kind of can intimidate gardeners, right? And I
Yeah.
think a lot of my clients, grew up with their moms or their grandmothers, like mine, grandmother growing roses, and found it. And then we get into the chemicals and all the things that, that was a concern about growing roses. So now when I'm a landscape designer in people's yards, they'll say, "May I like roses, but I don't want roses. Roses are high maintenance. I don't want roses in my garden." And I confess, I very rarely, I love the carpet roses. So I kind of convince clients to do that and to try that. But I want to change my mind. I'm excited to learn more about growing roses because they can be that all season, next to hydrangeas, they can bloom all season. So do you want to cover like some of the maybe the myths or best practices for where do you prefer to start there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's begin. I mean, this is what I have taught and practiced for my, now 3 decades in the rose business and as a in the industry, but also you mentioned my book as an author, as a lecturer, speaker, garden designer, which I do as well. So I began growing roses in Los Angeles, California.
Ooh,
A good, not a good place to grow roses. And I started about 2 or 3 years in because I was reading all the chemical regimes that we're talking about, and I'll come to that in a moment. And I thought, I'm not comfortable with this.
mm,
My background is Dutch. My parents are from the Netherlands. I have a foot in Europe, and Europe is very much like Canada. Is very much chemicals are hard to get. We want to go more towards natural, sustainable methods of growing. Is the word that I like to use. So I began researching and working with that. Then moved up to year 2000, moved to our farm in South Carolina, the upstate of South Carolina. So about 26 years that I've been on this farm in the upstate of South Carolina, foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. We're on the East Coast, southern East Coast. We get humid, we get black spot pressure and things like that. I still grow roses sustainably. I have not sprayed an insecticide or a fungicide in all my 26 years on this farm. And I grow 250 to 300 roses at a pop. So it can be done. Here's a little fun fact for your listeners. So modern petrochemicals, which is what we're talking about with insecticides and fungicides, were not really invented until the 1930s. Interrupt that with World War II in the 1940s, not really be available till the 1950s. So that's now, what are we, 75 years, roughly? I think I can probably go with that number, roughly. So roses, however, have been in ornamental gardens for thousands of years. Mm-hmm. Go back to the Empress Josephine in France. I mean, go back to the Romans cultivated roses, Rosa Damascena, which is cultivated for perfume. I'll go way, way back. So if you think about this one little fact, roses have been grown far longer without chemicals than with them.
Good point.
Yeah. So that's the thing to think about. So what happened? Well, because these chemicals became available and people said, well, we can use them because at the time in the 50s and 60s, people thought they were safe. And that is what it is. It's a fact. We've learned now otherwise, needless to say. So what's begun to happen is that roses for a while, when the emphasis on that inherent genetic disease resistance and health became a little bit less important because you could go down to the local drugstore, hardware store and buy whatever it is you wanted to get. Yeah. Now that's changed rapidly. In the United States, Europe has been a lot further ahead of us than that. That's why you're seeing some of the European genetics come in. So the answer to your question, today's roses that are being bred, the kind of cutting edge roses we're talking about, are actually can be grown without major fungicides and major insecticides. And that's what I do in the upstate of South Carolina. It begins by picking the right rose for your region.
Yep.
You mentioned Canada is a broad range of climates. Absolutely it is. I'm sure there's things that can be grown in Victoria that can't be grown in Alberta and vice versa. And same in the United States. There's things that I can't grow here that someone in California can grow. So roses, you need to kind of have an idea of what's going to grow well in your climate. That's where you begin by the roses. You mentioned the carpet roses grow well for you. There are other roses. And again, a lot of the roses we sell are like that. They will grow well without a major care regime. Soil health is number one. I mean, that's the number one thing in gardening. Make sure your soil is healthy, make sure it's alive with mycorrhizae and all the things that go with that. Essential basic organic fertilizing program is what I always recommend. Organics are the best thing to feed. Compost, nature's fertilizer, composted leaves, composted horse manure, whatever along those lines, the good basic feeding program. And the last thing is, don't expect your roses to be perfect. No, the industry and a lot of articles have sold everybody on the fact your rose has to be perfect. It does not. No plant is perfect. Every plant at some point doesn't look that good. And that's inevitably what happens. But roses, if you pick the right rose, feed your soil, give it a good basic feeding program. A rose is nothing more, as I always say, than a flowering shrub. And that's how I love people to look at it. So you talked about diversity. Okay. These are roses, unlike the early species roses, which are spring flowering. These will bloom from spring all the way to fall.
Yeah.
They cover every color of the rainbow but blue. They will grow from 2 feet high. That will grow, 15, 20 feet up a tree, a climber, 5 foot shrub, 6 foot shrub, flower shapes of single petals to full petals to fragrance. So you're a landscape designer. So I have now just given you a palette of plants that's going to fit any height, any shape, and it's going to bloom from spring to fall, and your color palette is nearly unlimited.
Yeah.
And that's how I want.
In gardens, right? I should be putting them.
Yes, you should, Joanna. You should be putting them in gardens. Yes. Absolutely. I mean, that's when I design gardens. I never designed a garden without roses going in. And sometimes, now granted, people tend to come to me for design because they know they're going to get roses.
Yes.
But even then, sometimes I have to go, no, we'll pick the right roses and you'll be okay. One of the things I do is I transition public botanical gardens from chemical to sustainable. Ooh. It's a 2-year process, and I tell people right up front, it's going to take a couple of years. Your garden's going to look worse before it looks better. Because we have to wean them and we have to figure out what roses do well and what roses don't do well, and then find roses that do well and replace them with the right kinds of genetics. But yes, it's very possible to grow roses without any more care than the hydrangea that you mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, in Canada, we do, well, I think it's all of Canada. I know I'm in Ontario, so specifically for sure Ontario. We don't have access to a lot of chemicals anymore. The rose dust that, the dust and all the sprays that I remember growing up,
Good.
So we actually don't even have them. And I think people panic about that. And so something like, I think black spot, I think is because it's the most visible thing that people notice, as well as the winter care. So what do you feel like the black spot has been breeded out of the roses, or is there a way to prevent it from happening?
So it's the latter. There's no way. So black spot is a fungus. It's an airborne fungus that lands on the plant, needs the right kind of hot, humid conditions to basically to spread, essentially. Right. There are roses that are more inherently disease resistant than others. So that is the first criteria. And that's what Bakker was looking for in their fields. They were looking for roses that, because they weren't spraying. So they were looking for roses that had a natural resistance to begin with.
Yeah.
So then what do you do from there? It's like a human being. We all have a natural resistance to infect colds and flus and things along those lines. Okay. Then it's the life choices that we make that potentially help that. If nutrition, take your vitamin C, all the things that we've all heard. So it's the same with the roses. I mentioned soil health and an organic fertilizer program. Give that rose the nutritious background it needs to help fight off that disease, essentially is what it's going to do. Then the other equation in this is know the timing of the garden. So let me use my example in the upstate of South Carolina. I have black spot pressure. Okay. I'm going to be, warm and humid in the summertime. I'm going to be probably, 85 Fahrenheit, which is, I'm not good at this. I think that's probably around 25 centigrade, if my memory serves. Ours are too. Yeah. Okay. Oh, good. Okay. And so I'm going to get black spot pressure. And I know I'm going to get it in July and August, which for me is the height of my summer. So I don't know what your Ontario climate is like. Mm-hmm. Okay. So same example. So I know from experience that come that time of year, my roses, because of the heat and the humidity, are going to go into a semi-dormant state. That's just what they do because they're not really happy in that. And this is again, these are broad brushstrokes. Please understand. That's what I find. So what I do with my gardens and when I work with clients is my garden in this July and August is not a rose garden. It's a perennial garden. I have perennials that bloom heavily in the summertime, Rudbeckia, agastaches, things like that, because that's my summertime color. And that's where that comes from. So now we get into what Graham Stewart Thomas called the art of gardening with roses. Mix in other plants with your roses. They don't have to live in a boxwood island by themselves. They actually flourish much better if you put them in with perennials and shrubs and things that flower. That helps bring in the beneficial insects. So now you don't need insecticides. All that diversity of cross planting that goes. So know your climate and know what it's going to be like and know, okay, you're in Ontario. So probably in July, your roses are probably going to go a little semi-dormant. when you design the garden for your clients and say, okay, we're going to put roses in, but I'm going to make sure I've got good summer blooming perennials. And that's going to be your pop of color in the summertime when the roses are kind of quiet. And that's also a great time then to go through and groom the roses.
Okay.
Take them back by about a third because they will, clean them up a little bit, do that kind of thing. And then you're essentially setting up for the fall flowering, which is the next really great flowering.
Okay. So you
Know the
see them as
rhythm.
kind of a shoulder season type of like the blooming, the first flush in May, June, and or maybe more June, and then again, I guess depending on the weather. And
Yeah.
everybody's summer's always different, and of course summer will be different depending on our listener. But so yeah, so not necessarily an all season like it's always going to be in bloom, but it will repeat bloom throughout a season.
That's how I look at it for my climate. Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you're in a much colder climate and your season is compressed, you're going to have blooms literally all season because your season may only be 2.5 months.
Yeah.
If you're in Los Angeles, you're going to have roses all year long. If you can irrigate. So that's where you have to kind of work with the climate, with what your climate gives you. So again, that's why I said it's a broad brushstroke. But once you begin to understand when the roses do extremely well and when they kind of want to go a little bit quiet, then again, that's where the other plant mature, the perennials, the annuals, the flowering shrubs, all of that comes into play to me personally add just that much more beauty to the garden. Again, I mentioned there's no blue because the genetic coding for blue does not exist in roses. It's the delphinium gene. And so that doesn't exist in roses. Well, then guess what goes well with roses? Blue,
Yes.
delphinium, lavender,
Yeah.
all of that stuff, silver foliage, artemisia, lamb's ear, statius, all of those things sing with roses because of that color. So, layer that garden in. I mean, that's what I love is that layering of the garden and that constant experiment. I mean, 26 years in this garden, I'm still experimenting and playing, and I hope to gosh that never ends. I'm
Yeah.
preaching to the choir, expecting you.
Yeah, you are. Now, do you have, now it's like asking for a favorite child, but I won't ask you a favorite rose, but like, do you have a favorite variety? Like, do you prefer climbers? Do you prefer shrub roses or which one do you have more of
Wow,
an
that's a great.
affinity for?
Yeah, and thank you for not asking me for my favorite rose because in 30 years I've never been able to answer that one.
Yeah.
To be honest with. So here's how I'm going to answer that question. I mentioned earlier that roses have a broad range of growth habits.
Mhm.
2-foot high shrub, 3-foot shrub, 4-foot shrubs. Some are upright, some are sprawling in the way that they grow. Some are climbers, some are large climbers, short climbers. So I love all kinds of roses, by the way. I really like climbing roses. I like taking gardens vertically. I think that really
Mm,
adds to the aesthetic of the garden. You're a designer, you know what I'm talking about. When you can get a
yeah.
garden to go up, boy, that's nice. When your client can look at something from below, how lovely is that?
Hmm.
So with roses, because I have this broad diversity when I'm working with roses in the way that we're talking about, the first thing I ask is what's the rose's job in the garden going to be?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay. Because you did it with any kind of plant. So, and then the
Yeah.
example I use, which is an absurd, but if a client, for example, Joanna, if a client has a new house built and they say, I want some foundation planting to hide kind of the lower 2 or 3 feet of the foundation. I want a year round. You're probably going to pick a low growing evergreen.
Yes.
You're not going to pick a pansy.
No. My my
No,
my
because
my
that's,
favorite yews, my dense yews or my hills yews.
yeah, exactly, precisely, because that's what its job. So if a client comes up and he says, I would love a beautiful splash of color at the beginning of my driveway on either side. I would love this massive color. Well, then I might go with some of the roses that are lower growing, for example. Would work really really well for that. And I'm just trying to see what we're making sure we've got. So we've got one called Party Dress, which is a ground cover rose that you can get in Canada. Honeybee Lovely Wedding Dress, which is a lower white ground cover rose. Mass plant them. Don't plant them 6 feet apart. Don't buy into the air circulation stuff. Plant them,
Oh,
if the rose, plant them so they touch each other. Make it look like one large plant. That's what you want to do. So
ah,
that's rose's function. The ones that I just mentioned, that's its function in the garden. So that's what you would then use it for, or maybe to line a walkway because you don't want something 8 foot high lining a walkway.
right.
So that's where that rose has come in. And then you say, okay, I want something a little bit taller. Well, now you can get into the grandiflora, which is going to get maybe 6 feet high, 2 meters high. I mentioned Simply Magnificent. That's a wonderful, wonderful, tall, upright grandiflora. That's going to give you more of a formal hedge type, look to it. Okay. If you think of a traditional English border, that you think of a border, you think that the front of the border is lower, mid of the border is mid height, back of the border is tall height. Generally, you look at it from one size, grandiflora in the back, floribunda in the middle, ground cover in the front. So what's the rose's job in the garden? That becomes determined what you like. That being said, yes, I love the climbing roses for reasons I talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the shrub roses that kind of sprawl all over the place. I have a rose. Yeah, I do. I mentioned Flash Gordon from John Ford. I have 3 of the plants in my garden here, and I've had them here for about 5 years. And it's it's a single petaled, which I know a lot of people say that doesn't look like a real rose. Newsflash: the original species roses were all single petaled.
Exactly.
So it is the real rose, but I like the charm of them. I like the charm. It makes this wonderful big round bush that I adore, that kind of relaxed, casual look. I prefer the English style gardens. That's probably why I like those kinds of roses. But then again, the hybrid tea, which grows upright and gives you that big bloom on top, tuck that in the border somewhere, put 3 of them together to make a mass thing. You've got this incredible statement of color and pizzazz that's going to come at you for that rose.
Oh,
So,
yeah,
but again,
I see that.
as a garden designer, like you do with any plant, what's the rose's job? And I guarantee you, there's a rose for every job in the garden.
That is good advice for a landscape designer. I think
Yeah.
one of the traps the homeowners, when I mean, you probably experience that too. If you ever pop into a local nursery, right? You're like watching people pick plants and it's like, it's hard, right? Because you want to tell them, no, put that back.
I know it's hard to
that one. Right. So go, I think your advice about the plant's function, the rose function, where homeowners, I think, go to the garden center and they see something blooming and they pick because they like that color or they like that shape of flower. And that might not necessarily do what you want it to do in the garden. So I think that's one advice I'm getting from you, I believe, to really, where do you want a rose? Isn't a rose. I mean, they all have different functions.
Yeah, they do. Well, for so long, roses were hybrid teas, which are, roughly 5 to 6 feet tall, upright growing. They carry the blooms up at the top. Floribundas was the other class, 3 to 4 foot high, tend to be more cluster flowered. And that was it. So you knew you were going to end up with a plant that was going to be, 3 feet high, 3 feet wide, roughly, 3, maybe 4 to 6, 5 feet tall or something like that. Now you start introducing shrub roses, climbing roses, ground cover roses, landscape roses, the different growth habit. So yes, I would challenge the consumer, be aware of where am I going to put this rose and then go find the rose that fits that. On the website that we have, the jacksonperkins.ca for Canada, when you click on the rose, there's how tall does it get? How wide does it get? What's the bloom? So all of that information is available to you. But and that's where, again, as a designer, you know what I'm talking about. If you're planting a garden at home, even for the home consumer, even if you just take a piece of, graph paper or something like that, and just begin drawing circles, of how wide the plant's going to get and how tall, and then begin placing them and maybe use colored pencils and fill in the color. That little bit of homework makes it work. But yeah, you need to put a little bit of time and thought into what the rose is going to be and how big it's going to get. Because one thing that big roses don't like is being kept short. A 6-foot rose does not like to be kept at 2 feet high. It's like any plant. They don't like to be grown, being asked to do something they don't want to be. That's like saying, I'm going to take an oak tree and I'm going to keep it to 4 foot.
Yeah.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, exactly. So back to Jackson Perkins. So are we, with the website, can homeowners order directly, or are they looking at their local garden centers for these roses?
No, you order directly from Jackson Perkins' website. It's mail order. It's that what it is. And so Jackson Perkins, again, Jackson Perkins has decades and decades of experience in the mail order business. This is what we do. And have done it for years and years and years. And so they will order through the Jackson Perkins website. It goes, processes in our system. You get the full support from Jackson Perkins on our website. How care videos, planting videos, our call center for customers. We get all of that information is essentially there. Then the order is basically sent up to Bakker in Canada. Bakker fulfills the order from Canada, from their facility in Canada. So it is directly mail order, but that also allows us to offer a larger variety of roses than perhaps our local garden center can handle.
Absolutely. And I
They're
think that
ship,
gives the client, the homeowner a better, better time to make that right decision.
yeah, and Baker again, knowing the Canadian climate, is not going to ship the rose until it's the correct
Mm,
time to plant it in your zone. So you can
right,
order the rose now, but if you can't plant the rose until May, you're not going to get it till May.
right, right.
Yeah, so
And are they bare root?
they're bare root. All the roses
Okay.
are bare roots. They thrive without soil. And planting instructions are in there. And like I said, on the website, there's a lot of videos that we have filmed over the years of how to plant a bare root rose. And again, we have a call center that's available to help with this. If you're not sure, give us a holler.
Oh wow. Talk about, I mean, that's a great way to do it because when you buy at a local garden center or nursery or a big box store, there's not a lot of help, right? You're kind of on your own.
Oh, you're on
Um,
your, yeah. Yeah, you are. And, again, I mentioned, Jackson Perkins, 150 years and,
mhm.
of experience. So, our experience with, over 100 years of growing roses, selling roses, working with customers, Baker's, I don't know how many decades of experience, growing roses in Canada, working with roses in Canada, analyzing roses in Canada, and knowing the Canadian climate, and now direct shipping to Canadian customers, which is not something they did. But that's where this symbiotic relationship between Jackson Perkins and Baker came into play. And we feel it's an incredibly unique opportunity for Canada and Canadian gardeners, not just rose lovers, Canadian gardeners. Put
Yeah.
roses in your garden, a rose in every garden. That's my motto.
Absolutely. And I think it benefits for Canadians to know that they are being grown in Canada, that they are being grown organically, so that when they
Yeah.
get to their own garden, they don't need to worry about that. Like they need to proceed with their organic growing, their practices that they already use for the rest of their gardens, right?
But they're being tested sustainably.
Right.
How Bakker, there may be some organic type. The word organic is a loaded word, so I want to
Mm.
be careful to work with that. But these
Yeah.
roses have been tested in the Canadian climate under minimal care. And Bakker obviously grows and does everything by Canadian agricultural standards. But I want to be careful not to use that word. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, no, but that's the thing. They are grown in Canada for Canada. They're analyzed by Canada on the rootstock that we know does really well for Canada. So again, just trying to make sure that these are outstanding roses not only chosen for Canada, but are going to be great success, and also to give again Canadian gardeners this broad range. And this is just scratching the surface. There's a whole lot more that we're sending up to test, and we hope to continue to expand the line. One of the roles that I lead as a consultant to Jackson Perkins, an independent consultant, is finding new genetics. And I have
Okay.
deep contacts in Europe for several decades. And we're bringing in roses from Europe and other parts of the world as well. And those will find their way into Canada.
Oh,
So it's
excellent.
exciting. It's an
Yeah,
incredibly exciting.
it is lovely to travel and to see gardens. I mean, I'm fortunate enough to be able to do that and to visit
Yeah,
those gardens when I'm
it's,
out and about and yeah, with the European climate being slightly different, it's always amazes me that
yeah.
everything's blooming at the same time, right? Like it's just the things that we have more seasonally here, there it's a little bit
Yeah.
different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
particularly in England. In England, for roses, England tends to be June. It tends to be the height
Yes.
of the rose and perennial season. But yeah, I mean, it's lovely. I mean, I enjoy it. I love seeing working with new breeders and plant breeders and rose breeders and seeing what they're doing. And a good rose breeder, in my opinion, having been in this for a while, is someone who has a focus, who knows where they want to go with roses. And I think that's what we tend to look for here with Jackson Perkins. What's your focus? We have a French rose breeder that we're working with who does what I call quintessential French roses. And people ask me, how do you know it's a French rose? And it's just like, you just know. It's got a
Oh,
charm, fragrance, and everything about it is just quintessentially French. And I mean that in a very positive way because it's a country
yeah.
that I adore, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful. And so that's, we're looking for those kind of things that are a little bit different and a little bit unique. And again, they will find, Baker will get them all. We have to bring them in through quarantine processes, which we, of course, totally believe in, but they will
Right.
find their way to Baker. So yeah, I mean, these French roses from this French rose breeder will find their way into Canada.
Oh, that is very exciting. That is
Yeah.
smart. And I love the support. So that it's mail order roses. So Jackson Perkins .ca, like you said. And then you are not just buying a rose, you are also have kind of feel like tech support almost, right? Because you've
Yeah,
got a
yeah.
call center that can help you. So that's great for anybody that's a beginner rose grower or people that are afraid, like me, who've been tentative to in my own garden as well as with clients, because the first word out of clients' mouths is I want low maintenance, right?
Yeah.
And I
Oh,
have
I
my
know.
little joke about how, well, I don't design with plastic plants, and plastic plants
Yeah.
aren't low maintenance anyway because you have to wash them. So
Yes. Yeah.
so yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that is exciting to know that the low maintenance part can come from the support and the knowledge base to get help in order to succeed at growing roses.
Yeah, it is. And the low maintenance, it's good horticulture, like any
Mm-hmm.
plant.
Yeah.
Low maintenance plant, high maintenance plant, and some roses are more maintenance than others. It's not saying that we don't, but we try to identify which ones those are,
Right.
for sure. But yeah, that's where it becomes variety selection, good horticulture, and being willing to live with a little bit of disease at the time of year when that's just going to happen.
Right.
And understanding that's the rhythm of the plant's life. And that's just what happens, and accepting it. And yeah, I mean, they're absolutely wonderful. But yeah, I mean, you're getting, Canada is getting between Jackson Perkins and Bakker, probably a couple hundred years of combined history and passion and knowledge and a love for the what we all call the Queen of Flowers.
That's right. That's right. Well,
Yeah.
before we go, I'm going to ask you about climbing roses. So I'm just going to, because
Yeah.
I feel like that, since it's one of your favorites, so I'm going to end you on, instead of asking about your favorite rose, I just want to get sure, because as a landscape designer, I feel like that's something with people having smaller spaces, a lot of fencing, and I'm using climbing hydrangea and I'm using other vines, but
Yeah.
I'm afraid to, I don't know, afraid or intimidated to use climbing roses. One, the thorns people worry about, and two, the support. Like, I feel like, okay, the roses, when it comes to the fence and the rose is going to win and take down the fence. But what is your advice, or how do you design with climbing roses?
Yeah. So with climbing roses, and there's a wonderful quote, by the way, you talked about thorns. It says, "Don't be sad because roses have thorns. Be glad because thorns have roses."
Ah, very good.
Turn it on its head a little bit. So
Yeah.
climbing roses, here's what to understand. Again, um, yeah, let me talk about generality and working with them. We talked earlier about know your plant and know how big it's going to get. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You have climbing roses that may grow 8 feet tall at the end of the day. You have climbing roses that may grow 12 to 15 feet tall at the end of the day. Then you have rambling roses, which can get 30 feet tall at the end of the day. Okay. Now, what we sell at Jackson Perkins and through Canada are going to be the climbers between the 8 and 15 foot model.
Okay.
So that's a manageable rose. But again, I mentioned earlier that roses that grow to a certain height, they want to get to mature size before they start to, and then you don't want to be cutting them down. So you don't want to
Mm-hmm.
say, I've only got room for an 8 foot climber on an obelisk, for example, on a short fence, and put in a 15 footer and then try to keep it trimmed. It's not going to be happy. So a couple quirks about climbing roses to understand. It's a 3 year commitment to really get a climbing rose to come into its own. The terms that we use, year one is sleep, year two is creep, year three is leap. You've heard that term before for
Yes.
other plants.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's what they do. First year you plant them, they're establishing roots. You'll see some growth, not a lot. Maybe you might see a flower or two. Second year, they start to grow a little bit more. You see more canes, a lot of greens, some flowering. The third year, they come into their own. Now, because of this process of taking time to come into their own, that's why you want to let them get to the mature size they want to be and not try to contain them in a shorter space.
Okay.
So first of all, pick it according to the size that you want it to do. The roses that I talked about, these 8 to 15 foot climbers, will never take down a fence. I have them on every fence that I have on this property has roses on it if I can get them on it. So I've never had a fence come down. It's got to be a stout fence. I mean, you can't put it on something flimsy, obviously. But I've seen them on guy wires, like vineyard trellises, so they can grow on that without any trouble whatsoever. The other thing to understand about climbing roses, and this is when it comes to pruning, With most roses, the general rule is you prune the rose, down to maybe, half of its mature size, maybe 2/3 at most during pruning season. Climbing roses, you do not prune because I mentioned they want to grow to their mature size. But there's two kinds of canes on a climbing rose, and I'll try to do this descriptive wise, and we have videos at Jackson Perkins that show this. The main cane, those are the canes that grow from the base of the plant, and they form your 8, 10-foot, 12-foot structure of the rose that you tie on the fence, you tie on the wall, whatever it is you choose to fasten it to. Then coming off of those main canes, what the term is laterals, the other term could be side shoots. They spring from the main cane. That's what actually bears the flowers. The more horizontal you train the main cane, the more of these laterals you're going to get. So 0 degrees to 45 degrees is what I called it the bloomerama zone. That's where the rose is going to bloom the best. But those laterals that bear the flowers, those you can trim all season long after they flower back to within 12 to 14 inches of the main cane. Okay. So let's say you have them on a fence and you mentioned thorns earlier. Okay. And your customer walks by this fence a lot. Your client or the gardener walks by this fence a lot and they don't want their clothes torn to pieces. I think that's a fair thing to ask for, quite honestly. Mm-hmm. So what you do is you plant the main canes, those long ones, you tie them against the fence, on the fence, whatever, hook and wire, whatever you want to do will work. Then as they flower and the laterals come away from the main fence with the flowers on them, then what you do when you deadhead the rose, which is cutting off the bloom after it's finished flowering, cut that back to within 12 to 14 inches of the main cane and keep it tight to the fence. Okay. You don't have to let the lateral get 6 feet long over the season before you actually cut it back at quote unquote pruning time. So you can groom these laterals on these climbers all season long, keep them neat, keep them tidy, and keep the thorns off limits. So that is a really quick climbing rose primer.
Excellent. Well, that is perfect. Thank you so much. And I'm very excited about this new adventure with Jackson and Perkins. And thank you for coming and joining me on Down the Garden Path to talk all about it.
It has been my pleasure. I'll talk about roses anytime, anywhere.
Excellent. Well, I may have you back then because I definitely have not done a lot of rose shows. So I that's when reading more about you and stuff and this topic, it's like, yeah, we need to talk about roses. I think they need to come back.
Well, thank you. And whatever we can do. I mean, that's been my mission is teaching gardeners that roses are not intimidating, that they are easy to care for. Right rose, right climate, and you're going to have a plant that's going to reward you for the rest of your life.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for joining me here on Down the Garden Path, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you, Joanne. It's been a pleasure.